Hi everyone and welcome back to Snippit Sports Science, proudly brought to you by eliteform.com. Once again, I'm here by myself on this episode. Jared will be back shortly with us, so just hold tight if you're missing his insightful comments, as I always do. Anyway, today's article is Salivary alpha-amylase response to competition, relation to gender, previous experience and attitudes. And this comes out of the USA, in particular the Pennsylvania State University. The reason why I chose this article was actually I'm doing a little bit of saliva work myself at the moment. My previous thesis was on salivary testosterone and cortisol. However, as you can realize that real-time analysis of testosterone in particular is just not available at the moment. However, you can actually get other metabolites such as alpha-amylase and salivary IgA. And because I'm working with some athletes at the moment, I read this article and it was quite good because it actually alluded to the response of salivary biomarkers to competition, and previously testosterone and cortisol and also the TC ratio have shown to have really great value in this space. Therefore, being able to use another marker is actually quite useful. When you look at the background behind this article, there's been considerable applied and theoretical interest in the psychobiology of stress as a source of individual differences in performance and behavior during competition. The biosocial model of status is recognized as among the most conceptual framework guiding this effort, and I actually read a lot about this through my thesis. And one of the model's basic tenets is that the ability to outstress an opponent is central to achieving or maintaining status. Correspondingly, individuals who are the most resilient to the stress of competition increase their chances of winning, achieving dominance or maintaining a desirable status or rank. The majority of the available empirical evidence relevant to the testing this stress-related component of the biosocial model of status has focused on the activity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or the HPA axis, as indexed by individual differences in levels in changes in cortisol. With respect to the stress response, there's two principal components. The first involves activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA axis, and the secretion of cortisol into circulation. The second and faster acting component involves activation of the sympathetic branch of the locus coeruleus autonomic nervous system, the SNS, and the release of catecholamines. While a body of researchers observed elevated catecholamine levels in anticipation of and in response to competition, this work has not yet informed our understanding of the role of the physiological responses to stress within the framework of the biosocial model of status. To advance the understanding of the interaction of the biological, social, and behavioral processes, like those hypothesized, it's been argued that the models need to include multiple measures of stress-related biological processes. In other words, as you can imagine, it's pretty hard to actually put one or two measures out there and say that this is the measure of stress or outcome of competition. Therefore, the examination of both the independent and interactive effects of the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis in the context of competition may be key in advancing the understanding of the role of stress in gaining or maintaining of status. In contrast to the non-invasive nature of collecting saliva to be assayed for cortisol, for example, measurement of the sympathetic branch of the stress response requires either blood sampling or a sophisticated psychophysiological recording apparatus and software. Logistical issues make these measurements approaches impractical when the aim is to measure individual differences in sympathetic tone or activation in most competitive situations. Recent studies hint of a less invasive and less cumbersome alternative assessment strategy. Several investigators report that salivary alpha-amylase, in response to stress, and support its validity as a surrogate marker of sympathetic activity. Not surprisingly, given interest in this marker has just recently been renewed, no studies have yet examined the biobehavioral correlates of individual differences and intra-individual changes in salivary alpha-amylase in the context of competition. Therefore, this study aimed to address this potential important knowledge gap. A decade ago, a series of elegant studies by Chatterton and colleagues linked levels of salivary alpha-amylase to the SNS component of the stress response. These studies show that the levels of salivary alpha-amylase increased under both physically, such as exercise, heat and cold stress, and psychological, such as a written examination, stressful conditions that salivary alpha-amylase concentrations were associated with norepinephrine change in response to stress. Release of alpha-amylase is regulated by the autonomic innervation of the salivary gland, which have been found capable of stimulating alpha-amylase release without increasing salivary flow. This pattern of evidence appears to support a link between the release of catecholamines in the bloodstream and the release of alpha-amylase from the salivary glands during sympathetic activation, hence potentially showing to be a good marker. It's also important to note in literature that the stress-related changes in alpha-amylase and cortisol levels do not appear to correlate. While it's clear the HPA axis and the SNS work in coordination to generate the physiological changes associated with the stress response, the exact nature of the coordination or the additive interacting factors is a subject of debate. One author, Henry, in 1992, speculated that the SNS activity increases in response to challenges that are perceived as manageable or controllable, whereas a HPA response is more likely during emotional, distressful, or uncontrollable situations. In relation to cortisol levels and competition, prior research has shown that cortisol levels increased in anticipation and in response to the competition for both male and female rowers. Novel findings included observations that novice athletes had consistently higher cortisol levels across the competition, and the pattern of cortisol behavior relationships differed by gender. For example, greater interest in team bonding was associated with higher cortisol levels across the competition for women, but not men. For men, but not women, higher cortisol levels before the competition were associated with greater mental preparation and competitiveness. Whichever way you look at it, these reports here and my own work has actually shown that these responses are really individual. Firstly, to the ability of the athlete, whether they're elite or novice, male and female, and also just to the actual group of athletes that you're working with. Certain athletes may actually respond really well in respect to a cortisol concentration, where other groups may not, or other groups actually may just have another marker. So once again, thing to take here, this is all individual. The purpose of this study that I'm talking about today is to extend upon previous findings of other authors, and in particular, firstly, describing the salivary alpha-amylase response to competition, in this case a rowing ergometer competition. Secondly, determine whether alpha-amylase reactivity varies by gender or previous experience. And thirdly, examine how alpha-amylase independently and in combination with cortisol is related to competition-related attitudes, behaviors, and performance. Following the biosocial model status I spoke about earlier, they hypothesized that the salivary alpha-amylase will increase in response to competition, and that this response will be similar in men and women, but greater in novice versus more elite varsity-level athletes. They also anticipated that salivary alpha-amylase will be inversely associated with performance and competition-related behaviors that promote success during competition. While the authors do not expect to find an association between salivary cortisol and alpha-amylase, they do expect that examination of joint activation or dissociation in alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity will be useful in explaining competition-related behaviors, attitudes, and performance. Here we see that they're using the reactivity of a metabolite across a competition or a stress as a way of trying to explain competition. Obviously, they can associate these metabolites with certain behaviors, whether they're physical or psychological or psychophysiological. And this actually just helps give a little bit more meaning. So if you can find a positive reactivity of a metabolite across a competition, it becomes a really powerful marker for the coach to use for their athletes leading into a competition. And in some other work out there with around midweek reactivity around a stress test in relation to a competition a few days earlier, this once again becomes even more powerful. The participants in the study were 42 members of a large public university crew team, 21 males, 21 females, aged between 17 and 31. There were 14, of which 10 were male, varsity-level rowers, each with at least 3 previous semesters' experience with the team, and 28, of which were 11 male novice rowers with less than 2 semesters' experience. The team trained 5 days a week from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. In this study here, they used a rowing ergometer competition, and this is an ideal context in which to study associations between behavior, performance, and stress physiology. Such competitions challenge individuals to row 2,000 meters as quickly as possible. Rowers are ranked according to race time, with the fastest achieving first place. These competitions are brief, around 6 to 8 minutes, intense, and it's not uncommon for a rower to collapse following a race, and it also provides a window into the individual performance of an athlete who usually competes as a member of a team. Throughout the competition, team members gathered behind the ergometers to yell encouraging words and motivate the rowers during the race. The atmosphere was loud, intense, and full of enthusiasm, giving that high level of intensity. The coaches also told the rowers that only the top 3 finishers by category in weight class would represent the team at an upcoming regional competition. Therefore, it was very clear to the rowers that they were competing against each other for the opportunity to travel to the regional competition. This here is an ideal situation, something that you can control indoors on an ergometer, but given that level of intensity through the coach's involvement in the study. With respect to biological assessments, saliva samples were collected without stimulation before the warm-up, 20 minutes and 40 minutes after competition. 3 baseline samples were collected on a non-exercise, non-competition day, matched to the collection time of the samples for each day. In particular, alpha-amylase and cortisol concentrations were analysed in the study. Behavioural and attitudinal measures were also measured. At the time of the recruitment, participants completed a short behaviour and attitudinal questionnaire designed to assess individual differences in dominance, competitiveness, and team bonding. Concurrently with the collection of the pre-competition saliva sample, participants completed a 12-item questionnaire designed to measure several aspects of pre-competition mental preparation. These aspects included dominance, competitiveness, bonding, competition-related strategic thinking, and performance. With respect to dominance, 4 questions asked participants to indicate what they were like as a person, such as submissive versus dominant, they feel inferior versus superior, not at all independent versus very independent, and so forth. With respect to competitiveness, these included on the competitive scale, I rode because I enjoy competing, and I feel motivated to perform in an effort to win every competition. 1 additional question asked participants to indicate what they were like as a person, not at all competitive versus very competitive. In respect to bonding, these questions included, I feel motivated to row well in order to bring honour to my university. I row because I enjoy having teammates and bonding. How close do you feel to your teammates? How many friends do you have on the team that you feel close enough to confide in? And what percentage of your free time do you spend with your teammates? In respect to the competition-related strategic thinking, this consisted of 7 items. 3 items were completed just prior to the competition and asked participants to indicate on a 5-point scale how often over the prior 24 hours they visualized themselves performing well and winning. Concurrently with the 20-minute post-competition saliva sample, participants completed self-evaluations of performance, such as, regardless of outcome, how would you rate your performance today compared to what it usually is? Are you satisfied with this time? And how satisfied are you with this performance overall? I really like the use of subjective questions in these type of studies. One thing I've definitely found in my work as after I've completed my thesis or my other case study work is these type of questions really add more depth to the outcome, because sometimes we may find that the changes in competition performance may be quite small, but the subjective questionnaires may actually tease out more information. And in particular, when you're using training protocols to elicit improvements in hormones and therefore competition, when you're trying to then tease it out between, say, 2 protocols, this can become quite important. So what do they see and what do they say? The main thing that they were looking at here was, does alpha-amylase change in anticipation or response to competition? And they found that there were no main effects on gender on alpha-amylase in any phase of the competition. Unexpectedly, more elite varsity level athletes had higher alpha-amylase levels than novice athletes during every phase of the competition. In the anticipation, that's the pre-reactivity from pre to 20 minutes post, and the recovery phase, which is 20 to 40 minutes post. In the anticipatory phase, the pre-competition sample was that they found that pre-competition alpha-amylase levels were lower than baselines for women, but not for men. In the reactivity phase, at pre to 20 minutes post-competition time point, they showed that on average, alpha-amylase increased 150% from pre-competition to 20 minutes after the competition. And importantly, the change over that same time period when measured at home or baseline on a non-significant day was not significant. In the recovery phase, that 20 to 40 minutes post-competition, on average, alpha-amylase decreased 40% following the competition, but had not returned to pre-race levels by 40 minutes post-competition. Faster race times were associated with higher alpha-amylase pre-competition, 20 minutes post and 40 minutes post-competition. This pattern is consistent with the observations that more elite varsity level athletes had both higher alpha-amylase levels than novice rowers at all times measured and faster race times. By contrast, there were few relationships observed between alpha-amylase and competition-related behavior and attitudes for the whole group. The exception was that greater interest in team bonding was associated with an increase in alpha-amylase in the 20 minutes post. During the competition, they also observed significant and time-lag correlations between salivary alpha-amylase and cortisol. These associations were modest and always inverse. Interestingly, while experience levels did not influence the nature of these relationships, there were clear gender differences, as the correlations between alpha-amylase and cortisol remained strong for women, but there were no associations at any time during the competition for men. Also to note, neither cortisol nor alpha-amylase reactivity alone or in combination predicted the competition-related behaviors, attitudes, or performance. Here, the findings reveal distinct changes in alpha-amylase in response to, but not in anticipation of, the ergometer competition. Interestingly, the competition-related differences in alpha-amylase were associated with previous experience and performance. The pattern and change observed for alpha-amylase was unique from that revealed from salivary cortisol. An examination of joint activation or dissociation in alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity during competition was useful in the explanation of individual differences and perceived dominance. In the discussion, the authors raised two issues related to the reactivity of alpha-amylase that should be noteworthy. Firstly, the magnitude of the effect was substantial, with levels increasing on average by 150%, and also the majority, around 80% of the participants, showed changes of 10% or more. Secondly, and perhaps the more important from the authors, was that these findings are the first to suggest that individual differences in alpha-amylase reactivity are associated with previous experience in the situation, as well as attitudes such as team bonding and dominance, and performance specific to this context. Much of the empirical attention alpha-amylase has attracted has centered on determining which specific aspect of the stress response it associates with. Until recently, very little information was available to guide us as to the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that drive individual differences in salivary alpha-amylase response to the challenges, or how these individual differences relate to outcome or interest. In the discussion, although they observed a gender difference in the relationship between cortisol and alpha-amylase responses to competition, and there was an inverse relationship between cortisol and alpha-amylase for the women but not for the men, they actually didn't go into what could be the meaning behind this. Perhaps it was just an individual response. A key finding for the authors was that examination of the joint activation or dissociation in salivary alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity to competition explained variation in feelings of dominance over and above that explained by the reactivity of either biomarker individually. Specifically, athletes with lowest levels of both alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity to the competition reported the highest levels of perceived dominance, while those with low alpha-amylase and high cortisol reactivity reported the lowest levels of perceived dominance. This pattern closely parallels the relationship between aggressive behavior and alpha-amylase and cortisol response to challenges observed by other authors. In one study by Gordis et al. In 2006, low levels of both alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity were associated with high aggression ratings by parents, while, if alpha-amylase reactivity was high, the relationship with aggression was non-existent. Some theorists have suggested that aggression is a form of dominance behavior that may be more acceptable in the context of sports competition. While the ergometer competition is not a context in which aggression is a useful tool for achieving dominance, studies of alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity in aggressive competition contexts such as rugby, wrestling, and judo would be valuable for confirming that low levels of both alpha-amylase and cortisol reactivity are tied to high levels of dominance or aggression. So why are alpha-amylase levels changing in response to competition? The authors of this paper suggested that Mazur's biosocial model implies that an increase in sympathetic tone facilitates both physical and mental performance, unless the activation of the stress response becomes too great. In that case, stress reactivity becomes detrimental to a competitor's performance, resulting in a loss of dominance. Therefore, in theory, the biosocial model predicts the greatest levels of alpha-amylase reactivity in the least successful or most inexperienced competitors. In reality, the role of the sympathetic nervous system in the biosocial model of status receives only scant attention and is not clearly differentiated from that of cortisol, and salivary amylase is never mentioned. For me, the rest of the paper spoke a little bit more around alpha-amylase, and perhaps they couldn't necessarily explain the reasons as to why it may have correlated with performance. However, when you take a look at all these type of markers, that's what they are. We try and definitely correlate them with definite behaviors. Testosterone's a really great one, correlates so well with strength, speed, and power, aggression, determination. More recently, the testosterone to cortisol ratio. That had been looked at the anabolic to catabolic ratio of an athlete or how well they've recovered. However, more recently, that's been shown to be an indicator of dominance and in some cases, an actual indicator of performance. What this really shows is that when you start looking at more metabolites, although we try and get a better understanding as to why it might work, what we're finding for this group of athletes, that it's a really good marker. And the advantage obviously being, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's real time. You're actually able to get this kind of data, analyze it at a pretty reasonable cost without having to send it off to a lab. And I think that's the advantage of it. But with anything that you do with these type of studies, you need lots and lots of data. You can't just do a one-off and then just read this paper and go, right, we're going to do alpha-amylase. Currently, I'm doing a project around cortisol, IgA, and alpha-amylase with one athlete. I've got approximately 3 months of data. Still haven't got a clear picture because this is N of 1 type of stuff. We try and tease things out, and that's what the good thing about this study is. They looked at males versus females, experienced versus inexperienced, and that really indicates the individuality of using biomarkers for trying to understand performance to a greater level. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. It's a nice way of trying to expand our thinking of using biomarkers to help understand how we're competing and how we're going, and potentially over time, could it be a marker of prediction of performance? And I think that has real value to us as coaches and to applied sports scientists. As I said, thanks for listening to us. Thanks again to eliteform.com. Please leave us a rating on iTunes. See you next week.